Hey everyone, CWD Music here. I'm CWD, and I don't like the word Dadrock. I hate it. It's one of those phrases and fake genres where I just kind of look at you and be like, the hell are you talking about, Willis? I mean, let's try to define dad rock here. From what I understand, dad rock is primarily associated with the 70s and the 80s, pretty much a time where a lot of modern day dads, or modern day dads at the time, were the stereotypical dad would listen to. A majority of it is just commercial, mainstream rock of like that era. So pretty much bands like Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, AC/DC, Def Leppard, ZZ Top, to a certain extent the Rolling Stones. Just a lot of bands under this umbrella of just rock music that dad listened to. But here's the thing, not every dad is the same, and this is pretty much my first gripe with this phrase. Let me give you an example. My dad never listened to bands like the Grateful Dead. He didn't really indulge in the Beatles discography. He did love some Black Sabbath though. He did definitely dig into things like Iron Maiden, Metallica, Bush, Soundgarden, of course Led Zeppelin, of course Pink Floyd. He's a big Pink Floyd fan. But the thing about it is, not every dad gravitated to the same band. Some dads were super indie and underground, at least for the time, like the Pixies, Sonic Youth, The Cure to an extent, Joy Division, New Order. They probably gravitated to a lot of the punk of the 70s and 60s, like the Ramones or the Stooges. There's just a lot of rock music that's existed between the supposed time period that dad rock is supposed to be in, that it just seems really vague and really not specific to the point where I don't understand why it's a thing. And here's another thing. New dads appear in every generation. Dad rock isn't always going to be associated with Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. At a certain point, dad rock is going to be associated with, say, car seat headrest, fill in the blank. You know, there's going to be a whole generation of dads out there that have heavily listened to a lot of newer rock bands that are coming out in the 2000s and so. Hell, there's probably a dad out there already. There's most definitely a few dads out there already that 15 years ago saw the Strokes perform while they were touring for Is This It? Or some dads out there that saw the White Stripes perform during albums like White Blood Cells and Elephant. And if we're going to keep going deeper, there's still some dads out there that listen to old Arcade Fire records as if they only saw them like 10 years ago. You get what I'm saying? It's an ever-evolving term that you just created, like classic rock. Classic rock for the longest time was only defined by the stuff that came out of the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. And now that we're entering a whole other decade, we're actually almost through with a whole other decade, the 90s is now up into strong consideration, and pretty soon the 2000s will as well. And if that doesn't make you feel old as fuck, then I don't know what will. Pretty soon you'll have bands like the White Stripes, the Black Keys be defined as classic rock. And therein lies my issue with dad rocky. Like I said, it's an ever-evolving term that really doesn't make any sense. Rock music that dads listen to. Well, what is your definition of a dad? Dads are caretakers of children that they have conceived with another human being. I don't understand why a certain brand of rock music is automatically tagged to dads, just on the basis that a good chunk of dads did rock out to a lot of AC/DC singles that came out in the 70s and 80s. And yeah, there were definitely dads out there that were into the progressive rock of the mid to late 70s. Bands like, of course, Pink Floyd, Genesis, Yes, Rush. But again, there's also dads out there that were super heavy into grunge music back in the day. Bands like Nirvana, Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, of course Pearl Jam, even some of the post-grunge stuff like Bush, as well as to a certain extent Stone Temple Pilots. And you also had dads out there that were super into like the hardcore punk and the metal scene of the 80s and 90s, like Black Flag, Husker Du, Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, Pantera, Lamb of God, I believe. I just don't get why tagging one specific corny, cliche era of classic rock that was just super popular back in the day and is played on classic rock radio is associated with dad rock, or dads in general. Because if I ever become a dad, I will have a large palette of shit in terms of rock music that I will have listened to in the past and will have loved a lot. Algiers, High on Fire, Slowdive, My Bloody Valentine, Nirvana, Ghost, The Beatles, Jimi Hendrix Experience, Bob Marley, LCD Soundsystem, The XX, Soundgarden, Brand New. The list can go on and on and on and on. Just a lot of rock-oriented stuff that I will have listened to heavily in the past and will probably still have on vinyl, and this is going to be associated with dad rock at some point in existence, even though it's just a really dumb made-up genre, or some kind of dumb faux genre of some kind. I'm not even sure what to call this. So yeah, I don't like the phrase dad rock, and I really don't appreciate it being used in kind of an unironic sense, because, like I said, it's like classic rock is an ever-evolving term, and it doesn't make much sense to me that dad rock is going to be associated with the brand of classic rock radio when not every dad jammed out to U2's One, or say Pixies' Where Is My Mind, or even say Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. Not every dad is of the same musical palette as one another. It's not like a whole homogeneous collective of some sort. But if you're familiar with the phrase dad rock, what do you think of the phrase? Is it legitimate? Do you think it's dumb as well? What are some bands and musicians out there you heavily associate with dad rock, and why do you think they should or should not be associated with the genre name? Do you even consider it a genre, for that matter? This is CW Music here, signing off.